So thanks everybody for coming to today's Alberta Transplant Institute seminar series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Karen Doucette. I'm the section chief in transplantation, and it's my pleasure to be introducing Dr. James Lan, our speaker today. I just want to start with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. I also want to thank Paladin for their support of the ATI seminar series. And so our speaker today, Dr. James Lan, is an assistant professor and clinician scientist jointly appointed to the Department of Pathology and Lab Medicine and the Division of Nephrology at the University of British Columbia. He's the medical director of the Vancouver Immunology Lab and a transplant nephrologist at Vancouver General. His laboratory is the principal site of the Genome Canada Transplant Consortium and a UBC Precision Medicine in Transplantation Excellence Cluster. Dr. Lan is a Michael Smith Foundation Health Scholar. He receives funding from CIHR, Genome Canada, Kidney Foundation of Canada, and CDTRP to support the development and application of new technologies to improve donor-recipient immune compatibility, minimize alloimmune injury, and develop solutions to difficult to match patients. Dr. Lan holds leadership positions as co-chair of the CBS HLA Advisory Committee, co-chair of the Scientific Advisory Board of Organ Donation and Transplant Research Foundation of BC, and immunology consultant for BC Transplant. He contributes to the education of future clinicians and scientists by lecturing in the Georgetown Series, the American Foundation for Donation and Transplantation, and the Canadian Society of Transplantation Fellowship Symposium. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Lan here today talk to us about the use of donor-derived cell-free DNA in the Canadian context.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doucette. Hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here today, and particularly because I understand there's a little game happening tonight that you guys care about. I have the great power that every team I cheer for, they tend to lose, so I'll be applying that power to the game tonight. I want to thank Michael for inviting me to come to you today to speak about the donor-derived cell-free DNA. And if you follow the literature around this, it's been a bit of a controversial test. And for the most part, Canada has been sitting on the sidelines. But I think there's an opportunity for us to change that with a grant funding that we have received jointly between Alberta and BC to implement this test clinically. And so here's my disclosure. So the learning objectives today is I hope to describe and to summarize for you the current evidence and the landscape about the use of donor-derived cell-free DNA tests. I'm a kidney transplant physician, so I will primarily be speaking to the kidney transplant literature, understanding that this test has been used in other solid organ transplants as well. And from a Canadian context perspective, I hope to describe how can we validate and use this test clinically to benefit our patients, and should we be using it? That's the other question that I hope to discuss as well. And finally, I hope to propose a pan-Canadian RCT to help us understand the context of use of this test as a routine surveillance test in transplantation. So I always start by showing a picture of my wife so she doesn't get mad at me when I travel away from the kids. My personal connection to the test is that about 10 years ago, when I was a fellow working in California, I was working on the use of NGS technology to HLA genotyping. And at the time, my wife became pregnant, and I wanted to know the sex of our child. And being a poor student at the time, I really didn't want to pay for expensive testing. But on campus, there was a team working on the use of fetal cell DNA to determine genetic abnormalities in the fetus. And so I approached the team. I said, can you just do this test on my wife? I'd really like to know the sex of our child. And they did that for me. And so there we took fetal DNA isolated from Danny, my wife, and was able to derive the sex of our child and that's Jake on the left-hand side. And a few years later, our son, John, was born, and this time the assay has been commercialized, and you can actually pay for that test, and the cost of the testing has decreased as well too. So some of you may even have seen that test in the people that you know. And so that was really the first kind of interaction with this test, that the fetal DNA could be released from the fetus and detected circulating in the maternal blood. At the time, we thought, well, this would be perfect for organ transplantation. When the organ is removed from a donor, implanted into the patient, and that if there is damage to the donor organ, that could be detected in the circulation of the patient. And therefore, that's the promise of the liquid biopsy. If we look at closely, where does the donor-derived cell-free DNA come from? The cell-free DNA is released from cell death, and that can be through apoptosis or necrosis. And the level is higher at the time of injury. In terms of what type of injury releases cell-free DNA, it's believed that the endothelial injury from the donor organ leads to a higher level compared to tubular injury. So when patients have interstitial inflammation or tubular injury, the DNA that's released can get cleared in the tubules and not necessarily in contact with the circulation. Therefore, it's believed that endothelial injury can lead to a higher amount of cell-free DNA being released. And the detection goes down when the state of injury becomes chronic or fibrotic. What we like about the cell-free DNA test is that it's rapidly cleared in the circulation. The half-life is usually between 30 minutes to less than 2 hours. So it represents a real-time assessment of donor health, allograft health. Importantly, the major source of the cell-free DNA comes from leukocytes. And when we talk about test reporting methodologies, it can be reported as a fractional component, and the recipient leukocyte count can affect the results that we get. So if someone has leukopenia or leukocytosis, that can affect the proportion of the donor fraction that's been seen, and that can affect the test results that we see. How does the assay work? So very simply, the assay is used to look for genetic markers that discriminate donor from the patient. And the way that's done is by the detection of things like SNPs. There are many different kinds of technology, but broadly speaking, we can talk about the NGS technology versus the digital droplet PCR. People that use the digital droplet PCR will know this is a much easier workflow, shorter turnaround time, and cheaper to set up compared to NGS. But NGS has other benefits as well too in terms of throughput. The approach of the SNP detection can be random using shotgun sequencing versus targeted. So in shotgun sequencing, basically, you take the DNA from the donor, and really we're looking for a lot of SNPs, over 100,000 SNPs that can discriminate the donor DNA from the patient and assign their contribution into the to assess injury. But for targeted SNP, basically there are these pre-selected panels looking for these SNPs that have high polymorphism between the population to identify which fraction of the DNA is from the donor and from the patient. Some of these tests have donor genotype requirement that we need to have the donor's DNA to be able to discriminate which fraction comes from a donor, which comes from the patient. And when it comes to quantification, we can divide it into fractional versus the absolute copies. And finally, the service can be centralized or decentralized. And for the most part, this assay has been commercialized. And in the United States, for instance, these services are offered as a centralized test service that the other labs individually do not perform this test. This is a publication that, this is a manuscript that's been in submission, and Dr. Mango is part of this team as well too from the STAR working group. And that really just shows to, at a high level, what are the different technologies that's being offered, what are the commercial assays being offered, and the test differences between these techniques. And what we're seeing here is that there's diagnostic thresholds that have been identified through clinical studies. You can see that for different organ types, the threshold is different. For kidney injury, for instance, a 1% has been used, and actually the threshold has been revised to 0.5% of late. The heart detection needs a much less amount to indicate injury, and lung is fairly similar to the kidney. There's also the opportunity for decentralized testing as well too. some of these companies have now started to offer kitted versions so that individual labs have the opportunity to do this test at their center. So we talk about a threshold for diagnosis of injury. Is there a normal range to cell-free DNA? And this is one of the studies published a few years ago now that really states, yes, there is actually a normal range for cell-free DNA. In this AlloSure study, they took 93 patients, 380 samples, and the median donor-derived cell-free DNA is 0.21%, and you can see the interquartile range there. Why do we care about this? Is that when we set a diagnostic threshold, we have to account for the fact that there is a variability to all the patients that we test. And in fact, here's the intra and the inter-patient variability. There is the reference change value. And what that is, the RCV stands for the minimum change to be considered significant. And that is not due to biologic or analytic variability. So when we follow patients, there's two ways to use the test. One way is you have a fixed threshold. And I think we can see the issues with that is that there's variability, and that may not be the best way to approach. If we want to follow patients serially, then we have to consider the fact that there is some inherent natural variability. And so 60% is kind of what we're looking at. This is a time course of donor-derived cell-free DNA post-transplant. Right after transplant, you can see a massive release that can be detected and then goes down over time. So the use of the test is now recommended in the first 2 weeks. Because of ischemic reperfusion injury, we're going to see that release of donor-derived cell-free DNA that is really not indicative of necessarily rejection, but just part of the RIRA process. But over time, that level stabilizes, and that becomes a baseline for that patient that we can use to track going forward to indicate whether there's injury or not. So now moving on to talk about the performance of the cell-free DNA test. This is the first really prospective kidney trial. This is called a DART trial. It was published in 2017. It's a prospective multi-center study. You can see just over 100 patients. When using the 1% cell-free DNA threshold, they were able to discriminate those patients with active rejection versus no rejection. The active rejection had a median level of 1.6%, and those ones without rejection had 0.3%. That seems to be pretty good, but when we actually look at a positive predictive value, that was really only about 60%. Similarly, the negative predictive value was 84%. Despite these kind of performance metrics, the authors concluded that the cell-free DNA level below 1% reflect the absence of active rejection, defined as T-cell mediated rejection grade 1B or greater, or ABMR, and the levels greater than 1% indicate a high probability of active rejection. So that was the first study that established the 1% threshold for a diagnosis of rejection. In a more recent study, and this one is a larger one, it's prospective, multi-center, over 1,000 patients. And in this study, they included over 200 biopsies, half of which were for cause, and the other half were surveillance. And very similarly, they saw that amongst patients with rejection, the median value was 1.6% versus no rejection, only at 0.23. But when we look closer at the performance characteristics of the test, you can also see there's much to be desired. Sensitivity and specificity, we're talking about probably 70 to 80%. And the positive predictive value is actually not very good, it's around 50%. But the authors conclude that the negative predictive value is quite high, and we can use that to exclude the use of an invasive biopsy. What I also found was that to be able to detect T-cell mediated rejection, a lower threshold of 0.5% was required. If one used the 1% threshold, a lot of these lower grade TCMR cases would be probably missed. So on that basis, most of the time now, they're recommending the use of 0.5%. What about the real world performance of the cell-free DNA test? And this is a very large observational population-based study. And if you follow literature, you will have seen this in Nature Medicine last year. Close to 3,000 kidney transplant patients from 14 centers in the US and in Europe. And what they're showing here is the mean cell-free DNA level amongst patients with different biopsy diagnoses. And if you draw your attention to the far right here, what you're seeing here is that patients with mixed rejection, acute TCMR, and AMR, they have the highest elevation of cell-free DNA. And then the other pathology that you see here, they really have very minimal elevation, but there is substantial overlap between some of these diagnoses. Based on these results, the authors conclude that the inclusion of the cell-free DNA to a standard care prediction model showed improved discrimination of area under the curve from 0.77 to 0.82. But when I went to the supplements of this publication, what we see, again, is a very similar story. We're seeing the sensitivity and specificity of the cell-free DNA around 0.7, and in fact, using the 1% was even less than that. When we look at the negative predictive value and a positive predictive value, although it's claimed that additional cell-free DNA is better compared to the standard of care data that we have, it's actually, to my opinion, not that substantially different. So looking at these studies, if you're like me, I kind of got a little confused because on one hand, we're having a lot of studies that show these tests are fantastic, they can discriminate rejection. But when we look at the sensitivity, specificity, the MVP, the positive predictive value, they don't seem that impressive. And when we want to implement this test and think about how can we use it for our patients, we have to be confronted with a clinical question: what is the clinical utility of cell-free DNA? And I was really happy to see this new paper that came out from Martin Nasons and Jermaine Wang in KI that said, well, if we're looking at clinical utility, we have to look beyond statistical p-values and area under the curve. So what is the optimal way to bring an assay into clinical practice? It starts with discovery, validation, and then we want to analyze the analytic validity of that test. And what that means is, this assay accurate? Is it precise, reproducible, or not? But then we quickly want to translate that into the clinical validity. The assay question is, the assay accurately predict the clinical outcome? And that's where all the things like sensitivity, specificity, all the things we discussed come into play. Based on those data, then we inform what is the clinical utility of the assay compared to standard of care. Then we design RCT to determine the context of use. So what happened with this test? It very rapidly went from a laboratory test for research into clinical implementation. And as we see, a lot of these things that are being asked were really not addressed in these earlier studies. And importantly, when we talk about these performance metrics, we have to think about things like sensitivity and specificity, which are independent of the disease prevalence. But when we want to answer the question of clinical utility, we have to consider things like the prevalence of the disease we're trying to detect, because in the low prevalence disease situation, it will lower your positive predictive value and increase the negative predictive value. Conversely, in a high prevalence situation, then the PPV will go up and the negative predictive value will go down. And these information are relevant for defining the clinical context of use. So to give an example, the rate of rejection in Canada in kidney transplantation is roughly between 8 to 10%. And it's not very high because the community takes great effort to standardize antibody testing to avoid the transplant of preformed antibodies. So in that context, our rejection rate is less than 10%. If we take the pooled performance metrics from the earlier studies and apply the Fagan nomogram into this test, what we're going to see is that when one has a positive predictive value, it improves the pretest probability from 10% to only about 25%. And the negative predictive value only goes down from 10% into 5%. So clinically, does that really change how we manage our patients? And importantly, in the low prevalence disease prevalence state, if we apply the test, what we're going to see is that it will translate into a lot of false positive cases, increased number of biopsies, cost, and potentially anxiety for our patients. Let's talk about the cost of testing. The first commercial test that became covered under the Medicare in the United States was the AlloSure kidney test, and it's been covered since 2017. The Medicare reimbursement rate for AlloSure kidney is close to $3,000 US. So I put this graph together last night. So this is the current exchange rate between US and Canada. So a single test will cost close to $4,000 Canadian. And I just did a bit of a pocket calculation here. In Vancouver, we do 300 kidney transplants a year. If we want to monitor these patients 4 times a year, which is actually less than what's recommended, the vendor recommends monitoring 7 times in the first year. But if I only do 4 times, so quarterly, at $4,000, it would equate to $4.7 million as the cost of the test. And I think we can all agree that that statistic alone is cost prohibitive for us to use that test in our Canadian system. What is the economics of the cell-free DNA testing? And there actually has been one good study performed on this. I'm not an economist, but the way to interpret this graph over here is that we're looking from the x-axis from left to right, we're looking at the effectiveness of the test as in quality adjusted life year. And what is one quality adjusted life year is that is the cost to spend to gain 1 extra year with perfect health condition. So what we want is for the quality adjusted life years to increase, but the cost not to increase. And so what you're seeing here is that comparing protocol biopsy to biomarker, in this case, cell-free DNA, one test at 3 months is more cost effective to do a protocol biopsy. If you were to do a 12-month test, it's also more cost effective to do a protocol biopsy compared to biomarker. And as a matter of fact, across all the time points, it's more cost effective to do a protocol biopsy compared to biomarker testing across these time points. And actually, the best case scenario is actually to do a protocol biopsy at 12 months from a cost analysis perspective. And then the study asked the question, at what price point does screening become cost effective? What does the price of biomarker testing have to be to come down to for us to use that test if we want to do repeated testing? I think we can all agree that the use of this test as a single time point measurement is not going to be all that effective. We have to use it many times through the course of a transplant to inform clinical practice. And the punchline in this analysis is that the screening of more than once with a biomarker is favored only when the cost is less than $700. So we're very far apart from the commercial price of the test from where we need to get to. And for that reason alone, that's why Canada has been sitting on the sidelines, because we cannot access the test easily. When we want to pay for the test, I think at least in BC, we're not able to do it. From what Michael tells me, it's hard to do it in Alberta as well too. So the Canadian context, how can we bring cell-free DNA to Canada? The first question is, can we bring cell-free DNA tests to Canada at a reasonable cost? Because if it's not at a reasonable cost, it's a non-starter. We're not going to be able to use it. The second one is, can we help to inform the context of use of this test? Because I think there are patients that can benefit from this test, but who are those patients and how can we use it? And there was this opportunity, which was very timely, that Michael and I started discussing. And this is a very interesting opportunity funded by Genome Alberta and Genome BC. And what they're trying to fund is for investigators to bring the test very rapidly from the development stage into clinical implementation. And we thought that we might apply and see if we're lucky with this, and we're fortunate enough to get that. So the title of this proposal is called Overcoming Barriers for Rapid Adoption of Cell-Free DNA for the Surveillance of Kidney Allograft Injury in Canada. And we can do that now because of the availability of decentralized testing that wasn't available to us many years ago, but now it's available to us. There are several aims that we hope to accomplish. The first aim is we want to establish the capacity to perform cell-free DNA testing. And we're going to use this kit called the AlloSeq kit provided by CareDx on the NGS platform provided by Illumina. This is a workflow of the test. We have a sample collection, we isolate plasma, extract cell-free DNA, and we do a PCR amplification. That's followed by library construction. We put it on the NGS sequencing and analysis and reporting. And you can see the timing of that workflow. There's opportunities to improve this workflow to make it more efficient for our use. But for when we getting started, we just want to make sure in our hands, we're getting comparable results as with the central lab. So the first aim of what we're hoping to do is to establish the analytic validity of cell-free DNA. And when I talk to clinicians, I tell them, we're not making improvements on the test. We're not going to say we're going to make a better test in our hands compared to the central lab. But the test result you're going to get will be the same as what you would get from the CareDx laboratory. And how can we ensure this? Well, in phase 1, what we're going to do is to test artificial cell-free DNA admixtures. So there are these admixtures that one can get that we can actually test by central lab and also in our hands to make sure we're getting comparable results. Coco on our team has actually begun to do this work. I should also say that what's unique about this grant opportunity is that there's an integration between research and also clinical institutions as well too. So in Vancouver, BC Transplant, the Vancouver hospital is actually directly funding into this grant so that we can very rapidly take this assay from laboratory development right into clinical implementation. In Alberta, it's going to be the same. Esme and Anne's lab will be doing this test for analytic validation, but quickly through Alberta Precision Medicines, we can flip it into clinical implementation. And that's our goal in the next 18 months. And when Coco tested this assay, we wanted to make sure there's and define the intra-user variability. So you can see that she did 3 different setups in terms of the PCR amplification, then she pulled them and do NGS, that these results were actually very comparable. And so that what that tells us is that in someone who's well-trained and she only spent about 2 weeks to learn this protocol, we can get very precise results on this assay. Then we went on and trained another staff on our team, and we wanted to find what's the inter-user variability of this assay as well too. And what you're seeing here is, again, actually it turns out that when they're well-trained through the protocol, we're getting very comparable results from the different users. The next question that we have is, if you use a MiSeq instrument, the MiSeq instrument is now beginning to be phased out. And in our lab, we acquire a NextSeq instrument. And so we're in that transition phase of NGS platforms. And we wonder whether switching from a MiSeq instrument to a NextSeq instrument is going to screw up our results. And when we did the analysis and compare parallel runs, we found that actually the results were fairly comparable as well too. So it seems like this protocol is very resistant to these platform changes, at least from a sequencer perspective. Then we next went on to do parallel testing in our hands in the decentralized test fashion and compare that to the central lab. And what you're seeing here is that on the left-hand side, there's a bit of a blip. On the x-axis, this is the test by our lab. And this is, what you're seeing here is in gray, this is the Vancouver lab. And in the black, this is the CareDx laboratory. And there's a bit of a blip here. And these were outliers. When we removed these outliers, then we found out the correlation was excellent. Now, why do we get these outliers? And that's the impact of clustering, which we did not anticipate. So in NGS, if you're familiar with the technology, there are several key components to this technology. The first one is to amplify the DNA, and then you make library preparation. And on the flow cell, they make clusters, as you see here. And these clusters, there's a recommendation of what a cluster density ought to be, and it's between 800 to 1800. The issue when you over-cluster is that when the imaging is trying to acquire, then it has a hard time telling the signal from these different clusters, and therefore the quality that you get is not as good. And so you can see the impact of over-clustering, which screws up the image quality that we see. And that's in fact what happened to our patients. That were not, this is the first run that we did, that we over-clustered the loading, and the percentage clusters passing the filter was really not acceptable. So there are these quality metrics that we can use to make sure we get a good run. And after we learned about this, we went back to the vendor, we optimized the loading process, and the results were actually fairly good, and they were all comparable afterwards. So now we establish the analytic validity on artificial mixtures. The next step is to take patient samples and test them. And we're going to do this in two phases. In the first phase, we're going to take patient samples from kidney transplant patients that are completely stable. And we will also do parallel testing between decentralized testing and CareDx laboratory to make sure our results are concordant and within expectation. Then next, we're going to actually go on and involve our clinical transplant teams. We want to get confirmation that the clinical validity in our hands are actually comparable as well too. So we're going to get results from 100 patients getting a kidney biopsy and having them parallel run between our individual labs and the central laboratory. This is a recent publication from the Paris Transplant Group, and they also had opportunity to assess decentralized testing. And what they showed was that the decentralized testing results were very much comparable to the central test results. The R-square value was 0.95. At the higher range, though, there was more variability, as you can see here, a little higher in the decentralized lab compared to the central lab. But for the most part, the correlation was very good. Now, you might wonder, well, then, why are we even doing this analysis? They've already done it. Well, it turns out that the workflow here is important to understand. So the way they have done it is that the plasma isolation and DNA extraction was performed at one site. And there afterwards, they shipped it to two different sites, one done by the central lab and one done by the decentralized lab. And analytically, cell-free DNA is finicky in terms of isolation. So the extraction of cell-free DNA is a great source of variability, which wasn't tested in this workflow. And so in our test, when we do it, we want to make sure that all the way from sample collection gets split right away from our lab versus the central lab, so we can assess the entire workflow from the beginning to the end. So that's the analytical part. The second part is, well, how are we going to use this test? In the first year, we hope to set up and operationalize the assay. But in the next 8 months, we hope to offer this test to our patients across the province. How are we going to do this? Well, these are the three pathways I can think of. When someone has a clinical dysfunction that's overt, and I see them in the clinic, I think they should just get a biopsy. I don't know that the cell-free DNA test result has anything dramatic to offer to those patients. So I don't think it's a good use of the test to apply that to this patient population. In the stable kidney patients, as we said earlier, I think the jury is still out on that situation, that the routine surveillance of these patients using cell-free DNA, whether that's going to augment anything over standard of care, I think we still need more data. And we actually have a pilot RCT that's been proposed under review, which I'll go into in a second. But as we manage patients, we can understand and appreciate that not all of them fall into very neatly stable kidney function or unstable. There are patients with subacute clinical dysfunction. And what I mean is that patients that have a creatinine fluctuation between 10 to 25%. And we see these patients all the time. And when we see them in these patients, we tend to say, you know, hydrate yourself more. We'll see you in a few weeks and do more creatinine tests. And I'm sure the clinical team here has a similar problems we are in BC. We don't see our patients regularly enough after transplantation. We might see them very regularly in the first 3 months, but afterwards, they go everywhere in the province. And we might tell them to repeat testing and we'll see you for a follow-up, but the next time we see them might be 6 months later. I think there's an opportunity to use this test for those patient population. So the proposal here is that once we operationalize the testing, we can offer this to clinicians where they see subacute clinical dysfunction. It's not at a range that they would see, I need to get a biopsy right away, but I'm a little concerned about this, that they could use the cell-free DNA test to help inform practice. In the abnormal cell-free DNA, that would perhaps lead to an earlier biopsy to detect injury. But in the normal cell-free DNA, they may continue to choose to follow the patient. And when we apply the Fagan's nomogram here, we're talking about patients where the pretest probability of dysfunction is somewhere between 20 to 30%, where the test result can actually change what we want to do. So if someone has a positive result, their post-test probability go up to over 50%. Then maybe we do want to get a biopsy. conversely, if they have a negative test result, the probability of injury goes down to less than 10%. We may want to choose to conservatively monitor that patient using standard of care. So that is what we propose to offer the test to. And as we launch this test, we want to assess the turnaround time of our lab's ability to provide the test results. Do we get any run failures in this process as well too? And the appropriateness of testing. We want to make sure that actually the clinicians ordering the test are sticking to this pathway here. We then want to assess the impact of care. And we can break it down into two different types. Amongst patients with a positive cell-free DNA test, how many of them actually went to an allograft biopsy based on a cell-free DNA result? Are clinicians actually going to use this test and follow through with the test result? What are the biopsy findings of these patients? Was there injury present or absent? Then we want to see the time to the biopsy. Is it actually going to be earlier between these patients with subclinical injury compared to matched historical control patients that we just monitor using standard creatinine? Amongst patients with a negative cell-free DNA result, we want to see how many patients on follow-up actually converted to a positive cell-free DNA or actually had biopsy-proven kidney injury. Patient and provider perspective. So we talk a lot about how we're going to use the test, but are patients actually going to use the test, follow through with the testing or not? Does the test actually offer better care compared to standard of care? In the patient partners that we talked to, they said that there's a real concern about over-testing. If we apply this test and there's a lot of false positives being detected, that can really create a lot of anxiety, unnecessary testing that they may not want to actually do. That's something that we're going to explore. And finally, we're going to look at the health economic consideration in the Canadian context as well too. So Dr. Matt Kadaus is a transplant nephrologist with former health economy training. And Shahzad is a mathematical modeler as well too. And this team will look at using a discrete event simulation model to assess whether this test could be cost effective in the Canadian environment. So that addresses the use of this test in patients with subacute dysfunction. What about the clinical utility in routine surveillance? Should we completely abandon this, or should we come to explore this? I think with decentralized testing, with the test being cheaper, we do have the opportunity to explore whether we can use that to benefit patients that have stable kidney function. This is a recent study from Dr. Bromberg. And what it showed was that the cell-free DNA could be an early indicator of biopsy-proven rejection. What you're seeing here, as you see on the left, is the number of months prior to injury. And you can see those patients with a higher level of cell-free DNA, it actually started to creep up even 6 months prior to the event. What it concluded was that the cell-free DNA fractions were significantly elevated 5 months before ABMR and 2 months before T-cell mediated rejection, as you see on the right. So I think there is value of the test in surveillance, but if the cost can come down more, we do have the opportunity to launch this. The clinical utility of cell-free DNA routine surveillance, I think my observation is that more observational studies will not really answer this question. We have had a lot of observational studies, and we really need RCT to determine the following. Can the routine use of screening lead to earlier detection of injury? Not just detection, but compared to the standard of care. And would the physicians and patients accept the false positive rate? Let's say the test is cheap enough to use. We are going to find false positives. Is that going to be something that's a deal breaker for our patients and the physicians as well too? And finally, even if we detect the injury earlier, does the treatment of subclinical rejection actually ultimately result in better kidney care for these patients? I think that's not a straight line as well too. So to do this, we propose a multi-center RCT. And I'm excited about this because it's a way to get all the Canadian centers together to do an impactful RCT on a question that hasn't been addressed. And we have called this the CLEAR trial, the Clinical Evaluation of Cell-Free DNA for Renal Allograft Injury. What we propose is to have 11 Canadian sites, 1,600 patients, and it would go something like this. We would take incident patients with stable kidney function, then they would be randomized. they will be randomized either into the standard of care with creatinine monitoring or into the intervention, which is cell-free DNA testing. How often do we test them? We will survey them in the first year. And this is a frequency of testing that's been provided or recommended by the vendors. The patients that have an abnormal cell-free DNA test, they will be then go on to have a kidney biopsy. And the hope is that that will lead to earlier detection of injury and treatment. We will not specify what kind of treatments that they get. That will be left up to the individual physicians. And the patients that have a normal cell-free DNA will be monitored as per standard of care. What is the primary endpoint? So in a trial like this, we're not really going to see graft survival differences. However, we propose using a surrogate endpoint of eGFR slope change. And we propose using a 25% difference in eGFR slope. In our calculation, we found that with this sample size, there's a 90% power to detect a 25% difference in eGFR slope between the treatment and the control group. So this is a trial I think was really thoughtful. We put a lot of thought into looking at the surrogate outcome, into powering this trial. And now we have the opportunity to do this because decentralized testing has been offered to us. There's vendor support that will offer the reagents to support this RCT if it's indeed approved by CIHR. So we're going to wait and see in a few months. In conclusion, the elevation in cell-free DNA, we can see this in kidney allograft injury, and it can be used to detect rejection, but as it stands with the commercial testing, it's cost prohibitive, and its context of use is uncertain. But I think with decentralized testing, we have the promise that we can actually use it to improve the clinical uptake of the test, but we need careful assessment, validation, and also proficiency testing. If different labs are not going to be doing this, how do we ensure proficiency testing between all these different laboratories? And luckily in Canada, we have a very standardized way to do this through the histocompatibility laboratories, and we can use that model to translate into cell-free DNA testing. And finally, I think to answer the utility of routine screening with cell-free DNA, we need adequately powered RCTs. And if we can put this together for Canada, I think it will be an immense contribution to the field. I just want to acknowledge the BC investigators, as you see listed here, the Alberta team, that'll be part of this study as well too, the qualitative researcher, Dr. Fortin, our patient partner teams, the genome institutions, and the local institutions supporting this trial. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions.
What I always kind of wonder, which is never clear from all these presentations, is obviously the presence of donor-derived cell-free DNA can have a mixture of reasons, as you say. It can be T-cell-mediated rejection, antibody-mediated rejection, infections. That's all reasons where you can have graft damage, obviously. How does the presence of donor-specific antibodies correlate to having cell-free DNA present in peripheral blood? And besides that, if it correlates really well, do you see this test at some point replacing or side by side with testing for donor-specific antibodies, or will it be a time and a place for each test?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Esme. So cell-free DNA is non-specific, and that is the problem. It's more sensitive than creatinine for detection of injury, but it's not specific. So if the question is to detect AMR, and that's the population that we want to investigate, then we have to add another dimension to this to improve the specificity. And that's where people have tried to say, well, you should do cell-free DNA and DSA testing if that's what you want to do. And that is true. If you have a patient, if you enrich the cohort into DSA positive patients that all of a sudden have a higher risk of AMR, and then you apply the cell-free DNA test in that context of use, then that might be appropriate, And so I think we have all these tools available to us, but how to use them together and what patient population remains to be answered. Right now, we don't have a lot of patients pre-transplant. We're not crossing a lot of patients from DSA, but we're willing to cross. That is a patient population. We might actually want to look at that. Conversely, at least in BC, we're not routinely monitoring DSA post-transplant either. But for centers that routinely do this and they detect DSA patients and there's seemingly no injury, they might want to use that test to monitor whether injury develops later on after the formation of DSA. So I think there's many ways to use the test, but it has to be used in a way where it's very clear what is the patient population that we're trying to identify and what type of injury we're trying to detect.
We teach our residents, trainees, as don't order a test if you do not know what to do with the result. Well, it is the pre-test probability, as you said. We talked when we designed the trial a lot about an enrichment strategy to saying, should we do it only in DSA positive? Because we know 50% of the patients who develop a DSA only develop AMR. So can you use this test in combination saying this is a DSA positive population in kidney? Okay, the lung wants to speak to me. But can you say, can we identify fast and earlier in the grafts where the DSA actually acts on the graft, which is often a challenge. And the biopsy, we see that in the pictures, very advanced, very late, and not good for intervention. So that would be a scenario. Same with BK. You might have BK in the urine, and you can use this in combination to detect those earlier developing nephropathy than waiting for a long time. But Kieran, you raised your hand.
Yeah, welcome, James. Thanks for the talk. Great. I'm actually not going to talk a little long. I was just curious, the history of sort of diagnostic RCTs that they can tend to fail, or they can tend to be negative. And you know, we haven't held our other tools in transplantation standard of diagnostic RCTs. Everything else we use is really not all that standard. So is there a risk here that if there's a negative result that you would throw, you know, baby over the bathwater in some use cases where it might be useful, but we've said, well, it's not useful globally. So now it won't be funded, it won't be remunerated by health authorities. Is there a risk of that?
Yeah, I think there is some risk to what you stated. It's true that RCT for routine screening is very difficult to have a positive outcome, you know, and for a variety of reasons. And what we don't want to see, though, is what happened to some of these jurisdictions where the test was launched and it's reimbursed, and then people just start ordering this for a variety of indications, you know. And so I think our approach here, the roadmap that we propose is, well, let's get the test here first and learn how to use it at a cost that's reasonable. And I do believe with decentralized testing, we can bring down the cost to what I showed earlier, where in our range where we can afford to do repeated measurements. And the Genome BC and Alberta grant is meant for us to use it not in a routine screening fashion, but closer to where we want to use it. Patients with subacute clinical dysfunction, where let's get our feet wet on how to use that test first and see, does it actually help inform clinical practice? Because if it doesn't even work there, then the surveillance is going to be even more challenging to have a positive outcome. But I think the surveillance trial that we propose here is really meant to kind of address this fundamental issue where a lot of people, you know, there's vendors and there's investigators that are pushing for this test to be routinely used when there is no high quality data to recommend that. And I think if that turns out to be a negative trial, maybe it shouldn't be used in that fashion. Maybe it should be used and contextualized for the scenario I described as subacute dysfunction. And maybe that's where that test should stay at. Or maybe we have a better way to enrich, as Michael said, DSA positive patients or eplin mismatch patients where their inherent risk of rejection is higher and use in that selected population.
Here also, look, I think payers got better educated, meaning when one trial fails in that context of use for a diagnostic test, doesn't mean the test is bad. It's just not how you use it. I agree with you in the past, it said is, oh, it's not actually measuring what they claim. No, the discussion is way more informed. So if it doesn't work in a general population, but works in DSA positive patients, I think we can differentiate that and approve it in that context of use. At least Alberta went to that approach of reviewing new tests.
Second question, if I can, is just for, especially in lung, I don't know how to interpret sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, and negative predictive value for this test, because what we're comparing against is so bad.
Yes.
Yeah.
there a possibility that, this is telling us new information about organ injury, and maybe we should be calibrating our other tests on the basis of something that, if we have a really high molecular marker that can only find when we grab, when we've got negative other tests, I personally would kind of still be worried. And not saying, well, my other tests are all good, so because I don't really trust my other tests, especially biopsies. So how do we contextualize? I know it's better in kidney, but it's still not perfect. How do we contextualize those numbers when we have flawed assessments?
Yeah, that's the issue with the imperfect gold standard. And I think for kidney, that's why for our project, we're not really necessarily just looking at a correlation of cell-free DNA with a kidney biopsy tissue. We also want to understand what happens to these patients after the biopsy as well too. And so I think that's a part that's been missing. And some of these newer studies that have come out have shown that just the fact of a high cell-free DNA, it also is associated with a lower eGFR slope over time. So is it because we biopsy too early and it hasn't manifested histologically, but something is actually gone wrong? That part I think remains to be answered. And the other thing is most of the studies today have been using one test result, but I think repeated measurements is also what we need as well too. I think it's very difficult to make very good assessment on a single snapshot. Even with DSA testing, we also follow the kinetics of the DSA as well too. There's no reason to think why one single cell-free DNA test would give us a lot of information that's useful. So I think the change over time is what we can look at. So I don't have a good answer for you right now, other than to say that we have to look beyond just a correlation of biopsy data with cell-free DNA level. We have to assess the functional outcome of those patients who got a test and a biopsy to make that determination.
But I think it's also what you want to benchmark. In our heads, as always, a test needs to be against a hard diagnostic endpoint. But if you can do this test to avoid somebody coming from Fort McMurray to Edmonton, if that is your question, you create value in the system, but you do not support a diagnostic claim. So it's the negative predictive value saying is we schedule the visits every 6 months, but when the test is negative, you're not coming. Right? So you save the patient or you have a better patient experience, you free up clinic space. So all those are health value propositions. It's about, but in our heads is always a diagnostic test means it needs to be associated with a certain entity, but it could be a workflow optimization test. Right? It's what is the value proposition? I think analytically this test is good. It's specific for the graph. It's very sensitive. It's all about how to learn when and who to use it and what consequence or conclusion you draw from it, where it creates value in patient care overall, right? And it always is sold as a diagnostic test initially, saying, oh, you can diagnose and blood everything. It's the holy grail. And then I think there's more harm done to promising technologies by overselling them at the beginning other than doing very well designed trials and say, no, it doesn't work here, but it might work here at the end of the day. But vendors, investors are not particularly patient about generating that evidence. They need to generate revenue.
So, James, welcome to Alberta. Question from the clinical pharmacology point of view. In your RCT, do you control for optimization of immunosuppression, immunosuppressants? Because that could also affect your outcome. It could be a significant effect or correlation or compounding effects.
Yeah, so we're not really gonna tell the investigators what to do with the results. I think the promise here is that we're basically saying that we're gonna offer this test for you, and that will help you potentially guide the treatment based on the biopsy result for earlier detection. But we all know, because this test is not specific, and some of the injury that you detect may require different ways to treat it. Some of them will not require immunosuppressant or require other types of treatment. Some of them will. So we don't want to be too prescriptive about that. We want to leave it to real world.
But there is data around people using this or trying to use it in liver to titrate withdrawal of immunosuppression, right? And say, as long as there's no cell-free DNA coming up, that it's stable and I can go down in immune. It's a obvious potential context of use.